My name is Shannon. I'm 80 years old, and I want to tell you something about anger that I wish someone had explained to me clearly when I was young enough to have saved myself years of unnecessary damage. Anger is not the problem. The way you live inside anger is the problem. And most people, including the man I was for most of my life, never learn to separate those two things. They feel anger, and they immediately become it. They are not someone experiencing anger. They become the anger. They think from inside it, speak from inside it, make decisions from inside it, and then live with the consequences of all those things long after the anger itself has passed. I did this for decades. I called it passion. I called it honesty. I called it strength. But it was none of those things. It was a reaction I had never learned to witness before it owned me completely. Maybe you recognize this. Maybe there is someone in your life or a situation that returns regularly, and when it appears, something in you tightens very quickly. Something sharp rises before you have chosen it, and before you have fully noticed what is happening, you are already inside the reaction, already speaking from a place you did not intend, already doing something you will need to undo later. If that is true for you, you are not broken. You are simply someone who has not yet been shown what real patience looks like from the inside, or what controlling anger actually requires at the deepest level. I was born in northern Thailand, in a life that taught me early that showing softness was a risk. My father was a man who believed control meant force. Emotion was weakness unless it was used to establish position. I absorbed that lesson deeply, the way children absorb everything around them, silently, completely, without knowing they are being shaped. By the time I entered the monastery, I had already built an inner architecture that responded to almost everything with a subtle or not so subtle version of resistance and anger. I did not always show it loudly, but it was there, in a tightening of the jaw, in a sharpness of tone, in the way I moved away from people when I felt challenged, in the internal arguments I rehearsed in silence for hours after a small conflict. The monastery gave me structure, but not immediately freedom from this. For many years, I confused discipline with patience. I could sit still for long periods. I could follow rules. I could serve without complaint in the visible actions of the day. But internally, the anger had simply gone quieter, not smaller. It had learned to hide inside politeness. And hidden anger does not heal. It waits, it builds, it finds smaller exits more frequently. I was not mastering anger during those years. I was containing it badly and calling that spiritual progress. And here's what I didn't understand then. Patience is not the suppression of anger. Real patience is something that lives at a much deeper level than the management of reaction. It is not what you do after anger arrives. It is the quality of presence you bring before anger gets the chance to take over. Suppression is effortful and temporary. Real patience is a different relationship with the internal experience of being challenged, frustrated, or threatened. And that relationship is built over time, through something most people never practice, which is genuine, honest witnessing of what anger actually is underneath its surface fire. The first step toward that witnessing was understanding what anger was really protecting in me, because anger almost never exists alone. It is almost always protecting something more vulnerable underneath: fear, shame, the need to be respected, the wound of feeling unseen, the terror of being powerless. I noticed over time that my anger was most intense precisely when I felt most helpless, when I could not control an outcome, when someone refused to understand me, when something I had invested in was dismissed. In those moments, anger arrived like a bodyguard, loud, fast, convincing, and I followed it because it felt stronger than the vulnerability it was covering. When I began to look past the anger to what was underneath, something very important happened. The anger lost some of its automatic authority. I could feel it rising and also ask a new question. What is this actually protecting? What am I afraid of beneath this fire? Not as a way of dismissing the anger, but as a way of meeting the truth it was hiding. And that meeting, honest and without shame, began to dissolve the grip in a way that no amount of suppression ever had. You know what surprised me most? Anger does not respond well to being fought. It responds to being understood. When you attack your own anger with judgment and shame, you create a war inside yourself. And wars inside yourself are the most exhausting of all, because there is no peace treaty possible when you are both sides of the conflict. But when you approach anger with genuine curiosity, when you say, "I see you," what are you protecting? Something shifts. The heat remains sometimes, but the blindness that usually accompanies it begins to lift. The second thing I had to learn was the difference between the spark and the flame. The spark is the initial moment of anger, a thought, a sensation, a tightening, a flash of heat. It is fast, it is often automatic, and by itself it is not the problem. Every human being who is alive experiences sparks. The flame is what happens when you pour fuel on the spark, when you follow the thought, when you build the story, when you repeat the offense internally until it has become something much larger than what actually occurred. When you speak or act before you have returned to your own ground. Most of the damage that anger causes in relationships, in inner life, in the quality of daily experience, comes not from the spark, but from the flame. And the flame requires your participation to keep burning. This understanding changed everything for me practically. I could not always prevent the spark, but I could learn to pause before pouring fuel. I could learn to feel the initial rise without immediately treating it as a command. I could learn to breathe into the sensation before speaking from inside it. This sounds simple. It is not easy. Because the mind in the moment of anger believes urgency. It believes that if you do not respond immediately, you will lose something. You will be disrespected. You will be powerless. You will be wrong. The practice of patience is largely the practice of no longer believing that urgency. Let me explain what that pause actually looks like in real life, because I do not want to be abstract about something this practical. When anger begins to rise, there is a moment, sometimes very brief, where you are aware that it is rising before you have fully entered it. That moment is everything. In that moment, you can return to the breath. You can feel the sensation in the body without acting on it. You can notice the story the mind is building without believing it completely. You can ask, is this the whole truth? You can give yourself 5 breaths before speaking, not 5 minutes, 5 breaths. And in those 5 breaths, something changes. The nervous system begins to recalibrate. The prefrontal mind begins to return. The urgency that anger creates starts to lose its grip. Over years of practice, that pause became longer. And as it became longer, the space between stimulus and response became a place I could actually live inside. Not performing patience, actually being present enough to choose. That is what real patience is. Not the absence of anger, but a presence wide enough to hold anger without being entirely governed by it. There is something else I need to say about anger that most teachings skip over. Sometimes anger is honest. Sometimes it is pointing at something that genuinely needs attention. A real injustice, a boundary that has been crossed, a pattern in a relationship that is causing harm. Patience does not mean pretending those things are not real. It does not mean swallowing every legitimate concern in the name of being spiritual. Real patience gives you the clarity to distinguish between the anger that is protecting something old and the anger that is pointing at something real. And it gives you the steadiness to address what is real without the destruction that uncontrolled anger always brings. What most people don't realize is that anger under control is one of the most powerful forces a human being can possess. Not suppressed anger, not performed calm, but anger that has been witnessed, understood, and then consciously directed. When you speak from that place, when you name what is actually happening with clarity and firmness, and without the distortion of uncontrolled fire, people feel the difference. There is authority in it that screaming never produces. There is impact in it that silence never achieves. The anger becomes information instead of destruction. I think about how much of my life I spent in the aftermath of anger. The repair work, the silences that lasted too long, the relationships that carried permanent marks from moments I could not take back. Not because I was a cruel man, because I had never learned what I am telling you now, that anger does not have to be fought or suppressed or hidden or unleashed. It can be witnessed. It can be understood. It can be transformed from something that owns you into something that informs you. At 80 years old, I still feel anger sometimes. I still feel the spark. The difference is that I rarely pour the fuel now. I know what the fire is protecting. I know how to give it breath without giving it command. I know that 5 breaths is enough to change what happens next. And I know that real patience was never about feeling less. It was always about being present enough to feel clearly. If these words are reaching you today, maybe this is the right moment to ask yourself honestly what your anger is most often protecting. Not to judge the anger, to understand it, because what is understood can begin to be transformed, and what is transformed stops costing you the things it has been costing you in your relationships, in your body, in your sleep, in your sense of who you are when no one is watching. Tell me in the comments, what situation in your life brings anger up most consistently? Just name it. You do not have to explain or justify it. Sometimes the naming alone begins to change the relationship. And if this message found you at the right moment, stay close to this space. Not because I have all the answers, but because I have walked the path long enough to know that real patience is possible, even for those of us who believe for most of our lives that it was not.